Okay, now we're coming to the causality session. And Peter C. will talk about the neural causation, underlying mental causation is criterion, not Newtonian. More time for that, so please, Peter.
All right, well, I brought up a chair because sometimes I have low blood pressure and sometimes I get dizzy and I have to sit down. In Japan, I actually bent over when I got dizzy and all the Japanese stood up and bowed. So to save you this one. All right, so let me just begin by talking about some examples. So if you take this case, if you fixate the center dot, whichever of the disks you volitionally attend to should be subjectively of a different lightness. It should seem to be lighter and more opaque and behind. So this is an example of a mental operation, a volitional mental operation, that doesn't require any motor actions. So I would argue that our volitional acts shouldn't be confounded with motoric operations. Does that work? Here's another example I was working on. So you'll notice on the right side that there's just these outlines. Now if you fixate the dot in the very center of the left here, I'd like you to continue looking at that for about 30 seconds. And when I tell you in about 30 seconds to move your eyes to the right, you'll have an after image. But if you volitionally attend to the horizontal rectangle, you'll see horizontal stripes. And if you volitionally attend to the vertical rectangle, you'll see vertical stripes. So don't do it yet, I want you to do the after image. So I started out in physics and math, and this talk I'm going to give you is actually a philosophical talk. It's all ideas. And even though I'm kind of on the empirical end in cognitive neuroscience, I've had sort of a tortured experience with philosophy. The first one was dealing with issues of quantum theory. When I started on quantum theory, realizing the degree to which it's incomprehensible, this led me to give up on academics for a while and move to Nepal, to the middle of nowhere, and teach school children. And I'll talk then about the second sort of philosophical struggle I had. All right, so now move your eyes to the right and volitionally control your after image by attending to one rectangle or the other. So these kinds of mental operations are volitional, but they're not motoric. And I would argue that the mental operations that are volitional are very tightly connected with what we call consciousness, in the sense that volitional mental operations require this domain of operands that we call consciousness. So they're kind of married like a hammer and a nail. But I won't be talking primarily about that. I want to talk about a philosophical problem. And this is the sort of the second philosophical struggle I had after deciding to come into neuroscience. And it really was expressed most clearly by the philosopher Jaegwon Kim, who said, if particle-level causality is sufficient to account for particle behavior, and neurons are made of particles, it follows that mental events which supervene on neuronal events can play no causal role in neuronal behavior and are epiphenomenal. Mental events cannot cause fundamental particles to behave differently than they otherwise would have behaved had they only moved and interacted according to the laws of particle physics. So, according to reductive physicalism, the appearance of mental causality seeps away into the one and only true causality, which is the causality operative among elementary particles. So this really bothered me for many years. And I would talk to other cognitive neuroscience people who said, who cares? It's just philosophy. So I actually sought Jaegwon, came out and went down to Brown University, and he was very kind, and he talked to me for a whole day, and it became clear to me what the problem was and what the solution had to be. And we had to bite the bullet, and the solution had to be to develop a believable physicalist account of downward mental causation, and there's nothing short of attacking that directly. So I spent the next several years trying to attack that, and the results of those attempts came out in this book a few years ago. So I'd like to talk about the general ideas that would underlie a downward mental causation, and this is going to take me into issues of the neural code eventually. So the question is, can information be causal in a physicalist universe, or in mental events we call it? So we have to start off by asking, what is causation? Many people have heard about this. Causality is traditionally schematized as event A at time t1 makes event B at a later time t2 happen. And not only must A precede B, but B must not happen if A does not happen. So this is consistent with the Newtonian account. But the idea has evolved over the centuries, the idea of causation. And we're all familiar with Laplace and his demon, and particles heating particles like billiard balls. And all facts about that, mass, momentum, and so forth, you should have a complete account of what will happen next, in a kind of block universe. Isaac Newton was also in this sort of vein. You think of billiard ball A being billiard ball B, and billiard ball B has very little say in the matter that happens. So there's kind of billiard ball metaphor behind this kind of conception of causation. Later on, people started to think about energy transformation, and there are many great people who thought about this. But the idea that you can take energy and combine it in different ways that transforms into different energy that has different properties. Later still came thermodynamics, and many people thought about this, but here people started to think about causation in terms of probabilities, which was a different way of thinking. And then came quantum mechanics, and these young men and others really came to a very different view. And again, I think it's important to understand that quantum mechanics is an entirely deterministic theory at the level of probability distributions. What's not determined is any individual outcome, but it can predict outcomes out to 19 or 20 decimal places incredibly correctly, and is a deterministic theory, but it's indeterministic at the level of actual outcomes. Okay, so more recently, people have been conceiving, or philosophers have been conceiving of causation according to this sort of manipulationist or interventionist account, people like Causation and Woodward here. And they kind of are formalizing what scientists already kind of do. We screen off all other variables, and we manipulate one variable to see what happens later. And this idea is, you're manipulating A and seeing what happens to B, your dependent variable, which is still in the vein of a kind of Newtonian conception, where B follows A, in a sense passively. But what I'd like to argue is that causation can also operate in a very different way, in terms of reparameterization. So, B's response, so again, billiard ball A and billiard ball B, B doesn't have to be passive, and certainly doesn't have to be linear. B can be reprogrammed or reparameterized to respond differently to its inputs, or to different inputs. And an example of that, I'll tell you a short story. So there was this bomb maker, Yayash something or other, in Hamas, and he was very hard to kill. And so what the security services did of Israel is they fed in a cell phone that they had programmed to explode only if he put in a certain code, a certain phone number to his uncle, I think it was. And this could have taken months or years, or even, in principle, decades before he put in this code. But when he did, and called his uncle, his head blew off. So I would argue that we need to amend the pro-Woodward type manipulationist or interventionist accounts of causation by emphasizing that the parameters whereby B criterially assesses A, namely these future inputs, that these parameters can be manipulated with no time constraints placed on when criteria may be satisfied. It might be years later, it's unpredictable. So Mill argued that there has to be a kind of covariation of causes and effects. So early causes would have earlier effects and so forth. This is necessary but not sufficient because, a rooster can predict that the sun will rise, but it's not causing the sun to rise. But this kind of notion of causation as temporal covariation applies to traditional notions of causation, but really not to criterial causation, or this reparameterization notion of causation, because the timing of the arrival of driving force is really unspecifiable. Okay, so now I'd like to talk a bit about how causation works in biological systems, because I think biological systems really hit upon a new kind of physical causation in the universe that really was not very common before that. So biological causation, if we think again in terms of A serving as an input to B, well, B has some say in the matter of A's effects on B because B places conditions upon A. So you can imagine a billiard ball that say, well, if it's striped, I'll do this, and if it's a black ball, I'll do that, if it's a white ball, I'll do that. Now, then the question is, how is this conditionality physically realized, and I would argue that it's very tightly linked with an assessment of phase relationships among energetic inputs, such as the shape of inputs and the timing of inputs. And so if you look at energy, which presumably is what fundamentally exists, it has an amplitude, and it has a frequency, but it also has a set of phase relationships. And I would argue that phase became central to causation in biological systems, and this is true at many levels. It probably was first expressed at the level of something like receptors and membranes. So you can take an NMDA receptor like this, and many things have to be true at the same time. The glutamate has to bind to it, so glutamate has a certain spatial phase, glycine has to bind to it, the postsynaptic neuron has to already be depolarized, and only then does the magnesium ion leave the channel. So that's a kind of coincidence detection machine. That's true at a much higher level of neurons, which have an integration window of, say, 25 milliseconds and need, say, 5 spikes to arrive at the same time. So temporal coincidence, which is a temporal phase relationship, becomes very fundamental. And I would argue that's true of causation at much higher levels as well. So biology introduced a new kind of physical causation into nature, which got highly elaborated in us. It's tightly linked with pattern, spatial pattern and temporal pattern. So spatio-temporal patterns in input can be causal only if there are physical detectors, such as neurons, that respond to patterns in input and then change the physical system in which they reside if the criteria for the presence of a pattern or inputs have been met. The criteria physically realized in the response properties of the neuron are not about mass or amplitude or momentum, heat, or any other aspect of the magnitude or type of energy. The physical neuronal criteria are conditions set on the spatio-temporal relationships among some portion of the neuron's physical inputs, realizing informational criteria that are placed on the informational content present in neuronal input. Relationships among portions of matter that release an action by meeting some decoder's criteria are not themselves material and may only exist by virtue of the fact that the decoder responds to them. Only by virtue of having a detector that can read this pattern and input is this pattern potentially causal, as, for example, when that detector then changes the criteria for firing another pattern between detectors. So what's the difference between what I'm arguing, criterial causation or causation via reparameterization, and more traditional notions of causation? Well, here's an example. When water falls down a waterfall, it just happens, in a sense, passively. The water sets no criteria to be met by the rock. The rock sets no criteria to be met by the water before some action is released. Causality here can be reduced to energy transfer among local particles. Global relationships among particles play no role in causal outcomes. In water falling down a rock, there's no decoder that waits for the arrival of a specific pattern of physical inputs before the water is allowed to fall. So information can lie in a global spatio-temporal configuration or pattern of particles. And importantly, such a pattern is not itself a particle or reducible to particles. A pattern is not itself made of energy in addition to the particles in which it is realized. For example, a postsynaptic neuron may only fire if its presynaptic inputs arrive simultaneously. That simultaneity is a temporal relationship among particles, but that temporal pattern is not itself made up of particles in addition to the constituent particles that arrive simultaneously or not. So I want to emphasize that information is not energy, whereas energy or mass cannot be created or destroyed. Information is itself not energy and has no mass. It can easily be created or destroyed. And this is because information is not realized in the substance of energy per se, but in its spatio-temporal organization. So criterial causation is really a kind of pattern causation or phase causation, where patterns of input trigger patterns of output. And the top-down criterial causation that I think is very important in the brain for mental causation is rooted in reparameterization such that decoders now respond differently to patterns in their input. So I want to talk now about the neural code. Neurons can not only make other neurons fire, they can reset the parameters for future neuronal firing. And this accomplishes the resetting of the information criteria that must be met by future inputs to trigger firing. So, why are they just all connected with gap junctions? Well, why would you want to keep their assessment of depolarization separate? Neurons keep their intracellular potential discrete because they each impose their own discrete set of criteria for firing on their inputs. To enact discrete criteria for firing, it is necessary to keep the summation of potential in one cell separate from that in another cell. And if the threshold for firing is met, and if and only if certain kinds of informational facts are true about the inputs, then the mechanism underlying neuronal firing assesses not only net potential of the neuronal hillock, it assesses these informational facts. In this way, physical criteria placed on physical inputs can realize informational criteria placed on informational inputs. So I want to briefly look at the neural code. So, for example, here's a case of this yellow refers to high firing rate. If there's a single cell, if the animal, the monkey's attending here, there's a high firing rate here. But if the monkey's attending here, there's a high firing rate at the attended location for a single cell. So obviously you're not going to do axons. There has to be something changing at the level of synaptic weights or other kinds of reparameterization, changing thresholds, or there's probably several ways. So I would argue that the neural code is not only a spiking code, it's also a synaptic weight code. In other words, information is not only realized in action potentials, it's realized in slow and especially rapid synaptic reweighting. So here's a brain, in fact, that's my brain, that's my head. That's not yet my head. So here you see these beautiful fasciculi, axons connecting neurons to neurons, and we can use DTI and get lovely traces. It's incredibly precise and beautiful. Now, one metaphor would be that this is sort of like the highway system, but I would say this is a bad metaphor. It's certainly at least a three-dimensional highway, but I would say a much better metaphor would be the train track system, where there are these shunts that will allow neural signals to go down one path versus another. And so you can imagine, connecting 2 points, one neuron to another neuron, this way or through some other path. And if you zoom in on this, then this section can be part of two different sort of epicircuits that are linking different parts of the brain. And so I won't talk about this much here, but it's possible that the information is encoded at this much higher level of epicircuits that can change on the fly. I want to argue that there's an even better metaphor, maybe, which is that if I were to measure the energy coming off of my vocal cords, I would get something like I need to filter that energy passing through the system with the shape of my mouth. But if I only had filtering, it would sound like this. You need both. And so, by analogy, spikes are sort of the energy passing through the system, and the synaptic weights are functioning sort of like filtering, the informational filtering placed upon this. Okay, so I'm going to build on the work here of these people and summarize that as, there's a common assumption in neuroscience that information processing in the brain is realized in action potentials, but recent evidence suggests that dynamic short-term changes in synaptic plasticity can also play the role of a neural basis for information processing. And the rules of the dynamic changes on the weights of inputs are not well understood, but sequences of such dynamic readout events can even be conceptualized as a generative syntax of thought that may have chunks analogous to words and sentences. If synaptic resetting can be fast enough, the initial spikes of a spike train or burst can reset synapses, and later spikes can meet those reset criteria for firing. The information in the future that will occur when these recoded criteria are met by future incoming neuronal inputs is not information that's realized in the present. The recoding of physical/informational criteria takes place in the present, but the information that occurs when those criteria are met occurs in the future, even if only milliseconds after synaptic resetting. And so I want to argue that this gets around the self-causation problem in the present, because information transfer and synaptic resetting take place over durations, and information is typically transmitted not in isolated spikes, but in spike trains. So I would argue that Hume was wrong, that there's nothing between utter determinism and utter randomness, because their criteria of causation offers this middle path. So I can say to you some criteria like, think of a woman. Well, you probably thought of some woman. It's not utterly random because it had to be a woman. But could I rewind the system, you might have thought of a different woman. And of course I can add lots of different criteria. So I would argue that information is causal in the brain and in the universe because it only comes into existence by virtue of a decoder receiving input that matches its conditions, typically placed on the phase relationship or pattern of incoming energy for the release of some effects, say an action potential sent to other such decoders, but a decoder also serves as a filter on the set of all potentially causal inputs, since it will only change the system of decoders in which it is embedded, for example by firing, if its physically realized informational criteria are met. So I would argue that information is, in fact, downwardly causal, not as a force, but really as a kind of filter, such that only physically possible paths open at the particle level that are also informational paths can happen. And I'll just end in the last 30 seconds by saying that the neural code is much more Wittgensteinian than it is Newtonian, in that it sets criteria that can be met in multiple ways. And so Wittgenstein talked about this idea of family resemblances. So because I'm running out of time, I'll skip to the conclusions and say that information can be downwardly causal because of criterial causation. And we're reparameterizing the information that will drive the neuron in the future. Only physically possible outcomes which are also informational satisfactions of present criteria can occur. So information is causal in the sense of filtering out possible physical paths that are not also informational paths. It's not operating like a force. Finally, we must rethink interventionist accounts of causation to include criterial resetting and other nonlinear input-output relationships. Thank you. Sorry for going over.